presentation. It's my inaugural at Durham, so it's a perfect place. Let me kind of outline my main theme. Basically, most people take as given that money has to be provided by the state or by a central bank operating under the control of the state. And I would assert that that view is nonsense. Yeah. And yet I would also remind you that many free market economists have often taken this view for granted. A good example is Milton Friedman. In his Program for Monetary Stability in 1960, he outlines various very spurious reasons why the government had to control the money supply. Things like notes have no intrinsic value, so if you have competition, people would print too much and stuff like this. 30 years later, giving my age away here, but people like me were merrily ripping Friedman's arguments to shreds. So when Friedman wrote this book, it was regarded as the extreme right-wing position. 30 years later, we were saying it doesn't make any sense. And we had a lot of fun. And by the early 90s, Friedman conceded the position. And he was on record as saying that he had no disagreement in principle with people like me. And not just me, but others, a small number. But he basically said that our position was politically unrealistic. And you think, well, that's a fair criticism. But he's no longer opposed on principle. And if you go back to 1960, when Friedrich Hayek published The Constitution of Liberty, he also took a kind of minimal statist position in which he argued for very spurious reasons, which I've now forgotten, that impressive, that the money had to be provided by the state, along with law and order, this sort of thing. So Hayek, 15 years later, famously changed his mind with two pamphlets that the IEA published, one on competition in currency and one on privatization of money. So the penny kind of dropped that why wouldn't money be something that could be provided by the market. And I would assert that Hayek, the later Hayek, was right, but he was also forgetful. And what he'd forgotten, so I can only assume, was back in 1936, his PhD student Vera Smith she wrote a PhD on this very topic, a book called The Rationale of Central Banking. Hayek supervised it, and she, in that book, outlined the cases for and against free banking, and then she pointed to earlier literature, earlier debates in Britain, in Germany, France, United States, and debates on historical experiences of free banking. They've all been forgotten about. And you get this sort of bizarre situation that the monetary textbooks are written by the victors. So 20th century monetary economists, for the most part, just took for granted that you needed, that the provision of money was a necessary feature, a function of the state. So I haven't got time to go into all of this, but what I want to do is focus on two modern examples. And I readily acknowledge that the idea of private money is shocking at first sight. I remember I was quite shocked when I discovered the idea when I was about 23. It kind of connotes individuals printing their own banknotes or minting their own coins. It's quite shocking. I would assert that these are perfect examples of private money. And let me also emphasize that I'm a monetary economist by trade, but I often recall what Gladstone used to say, that monetary economics was the surest source of insanity that he knew of. So I'll skip over the technical monetary economics, which I think would be, I'm happy to talk about it, but it's a bit of an off-putting thing. Let me just emphasize this, that my life's work has been on the importance of competition in money. And I would assert, going further, this is fundamentally important to a free society. It's not just a sort of, let's have competition in gas or electricity. It's much more important than that. So the two cases I want to discuss, one is the Liberty dollar. This is a case of a private mint operating in the United States, which was a great success until Uncle Sam shut it down. And the other example is Bitcoin. And Bitcoin, just to quickly summarize, is the first, not quite the first, it's the first successful example of a new, entirely new type of currency called cryptocurrency. It's path-breaking in a number of ways. First off, it's based on the principles of strong cryptography, which were developed 30-odd years ago. It has a novel production process, which is akin to gold mining, but using computers. It offers the potential for anonymous, untraceable transactions. It runs itself. It's the first ever private monetary system that is totally decentralized. And it's not so much unregulated as unregulatable. It cannot be shut down. So, in essence, Bitcoin is an apparently unbreakable cryptocurrency issued by an anonymous user network, widely used on anonymous, often illegal exchanges that the government can't locate. It's promoted and designed by anarchists who openly aspire to shut down the government itself. So the stakes are high. And obviously it's revolutionary, and the government would dearly like to shut it down, but they can't. So let me turn briefly to the Liberty Dollar, and then I'll come to Bitcoin. The Liberty Dollar was designed by a curious gentleman called Bernard von Nothaus, who was once described as the the priest of pot. And when I put this to him, he's about 70, he's straight out of the 60s. When I put this to him, he castigated me, and I had to apologise. He said, it's not pot, it's marijuana. Anyhow, he set up an organisation called NORFED, which is the National Organisation for the Repeal of the Federal Reserve and the Internal Revenue Service, Revenue Code. It was launched in October '98. His objective, and this is important, was to be to the Federal Reserve System what Federal Express is to the Post Office, by providing a currency that would be superior to Federal Reserve currency, and so force the Fed to improve the quality of its currency. In essence, it was a private mint based on gold and silver coinage. And the idea was it was to protect currency holders against basically the inflation to which the Federal Reserve is famously prone. Now, it essentially consists of coins and gold and silver, and also notes, a form of notes, warehouse certificates. Now, over the period of its operation, the Liberty Dollar was very successful and became the second most popular currency in the United States. Now, depending on how you measure it, the total issue was close to $100 million US. So, it was distributed to perhaps 250,000 customers, of whom I'm not aware of any complaints. Now, the important thing is the Liberty Dollar was, in essence, a precious metal coinage. I'm oversimplifying it. And it was periodically rebased as the greenback lost its value. So the bottom line is that if, for example, in 1998 you bought a $10 silver Liberty, it would have more than kept its value, whereas if you put that money in a greenback, you'd have lost half your value. So it was a good investment. The attitude of the government was initially one of kind of toleration, but then things got nasty. And in 2006, the US Mint issued a press release saying that the use of the Liberty Dollar was a federal crime. There's nothing in the Constitution to say this, but this was the US Mint. So in March '07, von Nothaus filed a suit against the Mint, seeking a declaratory judgment that these allegations were untrue. So the government then responded with a raid by the FBI and the Secret Service, which basically they seized everything, carted it all off. Then von Nothaus was hit with a federal indictment. He was arrested and charged with counterfeiting, conspiracy against the United States, fraud, and various other offences. I'm sorry, I need to show you one of these. I've got a slide. If I can get this thing to work. Damn it. sorry, I'm left-handed, you see, so I don't know how to get this. There we have it. There's an example. As you can see, it's an obvious counterfeit. An image of Ron Paul. And it's a good example. Now, it's okay, we've got this charge of counterfeit. This is the most important charge. Although the conspiracy charge is a very sinister charge. Let me just remind you the obvious. Counterfeit 101 is that the counterfeiter makes some half-baked effort to try to pass off the counterfeit as similar to the thing that he's trying to fake. Otherwise, it's not a very good counterfeit. Obviously, the Liberty dollar was rather different. It had images of Ron Paul, gold standard in leadership. It had, on the other side of it, Bernard signs it. There's a URL, and there's a phone number. So if these were meant to be counterfeits, they were very bad ones. Also, the Liberty dollar certificates were very different from greenbacks. Well, to start with, none of them were green. So you really would have had to be blind to mix the two up. Of course, they bear his signature. They're a different shape and a different paper. Of course, the second reason why the counterfeit charge is risible is because counterfeit implies fraud and intent to deceive, and there was never any deception here. So basically, if the Liberty dollar is sufficiently similar to official government currency to be a charge, then surely the government should be going after everybody. There are lots of substitutes. For example, there are many private organisations that issue notes. These include issuers of travellers' cheques, such as American Express, Parker Brothers, who make Monopoly, the board game, and Disney Corporation, whose Disney dollars are signed, obvious counterfeits, signed by Scrooge McDuck. And I'll give you an example. If I can. You see, it's green, and it's got the word dollar. And there's the offending gentleman. So why haven't they gone to him? Anyway, so basically, his defence was he didn't steal, defraud, misrepresent, or anything else. No force, no deception, no nothing. And his customers were happy because the value of their investments had risen over time. However, he was convicted. 90 minutes. Jury convicted him. He's currently free on an appearance bond. This is nearly 3 years after his conviction, and he's awaiting a potential sentence of up to 22 years in the federal slammer. That's a life sentence for someone his age. Now, I would assert that the reason why he was singled out was because he was seen as subversive. And the day of his conviction, there was a notorious press release issued by the United States Attorney's Office. And in this press release, Ann Tompkins, the US Attorney, made a series of allegations so mendacious that they've already become legendary. In particular, she asserted that attempts, let's see if I can get this, attempts to undermine the legitimate currency of this country are simply a unique form of domestic terrorism. I mean, it's just ludicrous. Just a couple of obvious points. First off, there's nothing illegitimate about the Liberty dollar. It's just as legitimate as anything else. So surely the Feds are guilty of undermining legitimate currency. The same thing that they got him for. The Liberty dollar was succeeding until the government closed it down. Since the Federal Reserve took over nearly 100 years ago, the purchasing power of the dollar has fallen by over 95%. So if this isn't undermining currency, then tell me what is. That's just the Federal Reserve. So, this is a key statistic. If that is not undermining currency, you tell me what is. And then, since when is competing against an inefficient government monopoly an act of terrorism? Whatever else it is. So basically, you know, the US Post Office is guilty of terrorism, sorry, the Federal Express, because it competes with the Post Office. And of course, the real terrorists would just love this. And then, anyway, there's no coercion, no terror, no nothing. So, basically, leaving aside any absence of sense, these comments reveal a total and elementary misunderstanding of the competitive process. In the provision of currency, as in any provision of any other good or service, competition is vital to ensuring good quality. Well, this is exactly what happened when the postal service was opened up for competition. So the root fallacy here, I can't emphasize this enough, is the fallacy that money is something to be provided by an inefficient government monopoly and not competition. Anyway, the guilty verdict was greeted with widespread disbelief. One blogger that I came across said, "It must be a funny kind of counterfeiting operation when a 1 ounce silver coin marked $20 was worth almost $40 on its silver content alone." And another remarked, "If we are not free to exchange goods and services for gold and silver, then indeed US currency is backed by bullets." So, anyway, there was a lot of mockery there. Which, let me just skim over this. So, of course, as with prohibition generally, you basically can't stamp it out. You know, you might take out one bootlegger or whatever it is, but another one will spring up in its place. This is exactly what happened. And since the Liberty Dollar was shut down, we've seen new versions of the Liberty Dollar, which I would describe as essentially the Liberty Dollar with some extra stay out of jail features. My favourite is the Second Amendment dollar, which some of you will know what the Second Amendment is. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. Now this is run out of an outfit called Bud's Gun Shop at 1105 Industry Road, Kentucky, Lexington, Kentucky. And on his site he explains as budsgunshop.com, a proud supporter of the Second Amendment, is pleased to offer you our Second Amendment dollar with volume pricing so everyone can commemorate his or her right to protect life. Notice, Second Amendment dollar is not intended to be used as United States currency, and any representation of such is prohibited by law. That's the stay out of jail feature. Obviously, I wish Bud and his buddies well, but I hope a bit of friendly advice won't go astray, which is go easy on the Second Amendment rights when the FBI and all the other goons turn up. Might help to get a good lawyer as well. Meanwhile, going back to Bernard, he's still awaiting sentencing. The case has become a worldwide cause célèbre. The judge is still sitting on this because he's been bombarded with embarrassing letters. And I think the current state of play is that a motion for acquittal was filed in March this year. And I'd like to quote this because it's a model of eloquence. It says, he stands convicted of counterfeiting. The irony of this is that if anything is clear from the evidence, it is that the last thing he wanted was for Liberty dollars to be confused with coins issued by the government. That would have defeated the whole purpose. He's always operated out in the open, this is very true. The verdict conflates a program created to function as an alternative to the Federal Reserve System with one designed to deceive people into believing it was the very thing he was protesting in the first place. So basically the judge is still deliberating, and I hope some of you will drop him a line to help him along. So that's basically the story of that one. Let me turn now to cryptocurrency. This is an example, by the way, Second Amendment dollar. As you can see, another obvious counterfeit, but I do like the gun. Now, where were we? Yes. The second cryptocurrency, of which the most famous example is Bitcoin. Now, this is radically new and very, very exciting time. In essence, this is a highly anonymous computer currency based on the use of cryptography to control the creation and transfer of money. Now, I want to share a slide with you here. Now, it was designed, it goes back to the 80s, really, when these crypto-anarchists basically got going. And the objective of founders of cryptocurrency is in essence to create the following type of society, a society in which the government is not temporarily destroyed but permanently forbidden and permanently unnecessary. It's a community where the threat of violence is impotent because violence is impossible, and violence is impossible because its participants cannot be linked to their true names or physical locations. So it's crypto-anarchy we're talking about. And it was invented, as many of you know, in 2009 by an anonymous programmer using the name Satoshi Nakamoto, who's since disappeared. Probably the most widely hunted man in the world. Its key innovation, I can't emphasize this enough, is it is completely decentralized, and it has no central authority or central organizer in any conventional sense. This means it can't be shut down. Now, let me just quote from the email in which Nakamoto announced that he had set Bitcoin up. He says, the root problem with conventional currency is all the trust that is required to make it work. You know, we trust the central bank, for example. The central bank must be trusted not to debase the currency, ha, ha, ha. But the history of fiat currencies is full of breaches of that trust. Bitcoin's solution is to use a peer-to-peer network, no authority, to check for double spending. That means that if I spend a Bitcoin, say, to Conrad, I can't go and spend it to someone else. That's the key thing. And he cracked it. He said the result is a distributed system with no single point of failure. And I've asked you to mull this last phrase. It's distributed, so it's sort of all over, right? But there's no single point of failure. So there's no place where you can bring the whole system down. So, now, as you know, Bitcoin's kind of created in a process that's analogous to mining. And basically what happens is it uses CPU power to solve mathematical problems using pseudo-random number methods, basically brute force. When a Bitcoin miner solves one of these problems, he or she is rewarded with Bitcoin. And then the beauty of it, or one of the beauties of it, is that although it's hard to find a solution, it's easy to verify one. So the network then verifies that you have indeed found some Bitcoin and you're rewarded with it, and away you go. The rules are constructed in such a way that the total supply of Bitcoin, well, basically every 5 years the amount being mined will halve. And over time, the total amount of Bitcoin mined will asymptotically approach 21 million Bitcoin. And there won't be any more. And even if you know, for example, come along with quantum computers to increase the computing power, the thing has a difficulty parameter which adjusts in response to the number of people mining and the power of the computer. So even major changes in computational power shouldn't affect this. Of course, you can never rule out, you can never say never, but it's well designed. The idea is that you want an inelastic supply in order, because that's a key to achieving trust, in essence. The fundamental problem with money, by the way, is how do you control the supply? And we know that doesn't work with central banks because they're always printing too much of it. So anyway, the demand took off, obviously. It was very shaky initially. And the very first Bitcoin transaction that I could work out was an amazing one in which somebody called his friend over, I think he was in Florida, I think, called his friend in England, who paid him in Bitcoin to call up his local pizza in Miami, the pizza place. It must have been an expensive pizza. I worked out it was about $50. And that was the first Bitcoin transaction, sort of. But then it took off. And obviously, a key feature of Bitcoin that makes it highly attractive is the fact that it can be used it's anonymous. You can do all sorts of things, trading on illegal exchanges and so on. So what I'd like to do is just to skip onto the broader ramifications of cryptocurrency rather than dwell on the... I have a paper on my website, or I can send it to you if anyone's interested, which does a lot of the boring monetary stuff, but that's not what I really want to talk about. So the hope is, well, actually, let me just show you one thing. This is from a bar in Berlin. If you can read that. I believe in honest money, gold, silver and Bitcoin. And Berlin is where the action is, apparently, in the Bitcoin world. So what I want to do is just stress, watch my time, I don't waffle on. I want to just talk about the broader social implications of cryptocurrency. And I think these are very, very profound. And the key issues are, first off, the freedom of the individual to trade. And secondly, the freedom of the individual to accumulate, move, and protect his or her financial wealth. In other words, the right to financial freedom. Now, obviously, there's a lot of deep moral issues here. And there's the perennial question of the individual versus the state. The best example of the freedom to trade issue is Silk Road, which you've all heard about. This was an anonymous online exchange system that used Bitcoin to enable users to purchase a great variety of goods, mainly illegal drugs. And just to give you an example, if I can get this thing. There's an example. Something I pulled off when Silk Road was still operating. Notice what you can get: some nice Moroccan hash, some weed. I don't even know what some of these things are. But anyway, they look enticing. And you've got to understand how it works, right? The Silk Road was a bit like eBay in that it used a reputational-based system. So if you had $100 or whatever Bitcoin to blow, and some guy's got 500 rave reviews, you might chance it. And if he rips you off, you'll just post a bad review. So he's using his reputation as a hostage to ensure people trust. So you're producing trust among people who don't even know each other, which is interesting. And secondly, there was an escrow system, so that there was partial delivery. If there was an occasional botched thing, you could get some of your money back and stuff like that. The system worked, right? This is very impressive. So it worked. So basically, the sellers have an incentive to promote and maintain a good reputation, and this discourages them from ripping their customers off. And the system worked, even though there's occasional spats. And the second feature of Silk Road that's very interesting is it makes use of the Tor, is the onion ring, in which essentially it allows for anonymous web browsing. One of my PhD students showed me how to get onto this stuff, and it's great browsing around the dark web. There's all sorts of interesting stuff there. So basically what happens is that the Tor software allows you to connect to a hidden server, and the location of the server is in principle impossible to find. So the key to Silk Road's success was that the government couldn't shut it down because it couldn't identify the operators. That was the problem that they faced. It's the problem they face with all the dark web stuff. So, judging by reviews on its website, customers seemed very happy. And my favourite was some happy customer who was reported as using it to buy 10 tabs of quality LSD, delivered directly to his home courtesy of the United States Post Office. Prices were a little bit higher than on the street, but then you would expect that because it's reasonable to pay more because you get home delivery, better quality assurance, less aggravation and stuff like that. Now, after it was launched, word about Silk Road spread rapidly across the web, and it was soon being described as the Amazon.com of illegal drugs. And shortly after that particular thing came out, there was some meddlesome United States Senator, Charles Schumer, a Democrat from New York, was calling on the DEA. He had a notorious press conference. We called on the DEA to shut it down. And let me just quote from Senator Schumer's comments. He said, literally, It allows buyers and users to sell illegal drugs online, including heroin, cocaine and meth. And users do sell by hiding their identities through a program that makes them virtually untraceable, if It's a certifiable one-stop shop for illegal drugs that represents the most brazen attempt to peddle drugs online that we've ever seen. It's more brazen than anything else by light years. Now, of course, this may not have been the intention that Senator Schumer had, but this served as a powerful advertising for Silk Road, and the price of Bitcoin shot up afterwards. So exactly how the DEA is supposed to shut down an untraceable trading network using an untraceable digital currency, he didn't point out. And again, I'd like to share some quotes here because this is one contrary view. It says, he describes Silk Road as the truly free market that hackers, anarchists and criminals have been dreaming about since forever. You can turn on your computer, browse the web anonymously, make an untraceable transaction and have a product in your hands regardless of what any government or authority decides. We're at a new point in history. Silk Road makes buying shit that can get you thrown into a prison cell for a decade or so incredibly smooth and simple. Oh, great stuff. And then he went on to describe an entertaining post on Silk Road where there'd been a botched deal and two people were arguing. And one guy basically, now bear in mind that every second word begins with the letter F. Nobody does this to me and gets away with it. And everybody started laughing at him. Said, you're making a fool of yourself. What are you going to do? You can't track anybody down. There's no violence. You see, that's the whole point. There's no violence. So, and then just to carry on, I just wanted to add another quote from the same. This showed how successful Silk Road, remember we're talking about peaceful dispute resolution. Right. This showed how successful Silk Road really was. It makes drug buying so smooth that it's easy to forget what kinds of violent drug dealers can be. Thanks to decentralization and powerful encryption, we're able to operate in a digital world that's almost free from prohibition and the violence that prohibition causes. So this is about real freedom, freedom from violence, from corrupt centralized authorities, and from centralization altogether. While Silk Road and Bitcoin may fade or be crushed, we've seen what free, leaderless systems can do. You can only chop off so many heads. And then this is the future. I think that's a wonderful quote. That's the essence of crypto-anarchism. And now, where was I going? But by the way, I should add, it didn't just sell drugs. You could, at one point, you could buy weapons. But the drug dealers complained that they didn't like weapons being sold on the site because it would potentially attract unwelcome attention from law enforcement. So they spun off the weapons bit as a separate site and then closed it down a few months later. But the bottom line is there are just not enough violent bad guys out there to justify the weapons site. But there's a nice thing where the drug dealers don't want the weapons stuff because it could bring bad things. There were some things that were said to be impossible to get. The founder, not the founder, but the manager, owner of Silk Road was a guy who went by the name Dreg Pirate Roberts. And it's basically his market, his rules. No child pornography, no assassinations. You can't take a hit out, although apparently he didn't quite follow that himself. So there were certain things that he took, we're not going to do that. I figured him for a Mises Institute graduate or some sort. And I think I'm probably right, because he had all the hallmarks. He had lots of quotes from von Mises, and he was a great fan of Ron Paul. So it wasn't, you could see that where he was coming from. And there was a certain sense of the language that he used was very much like that. But anyhow, the key for users of these sorts of sites is the obvious one of what's your personal security. So the weak link in personal security is delivery. You have to turn in an address. So one journalist nicely noted, he said, one can expect that sooner or later folks who buy drugs at this site will be seeing something other than a friendly UPS man at their door. And one can also imagine DEA officials setting up sting operations and sending in SWAT teams and so forth. And one blogger, again this is the other side of it, he described it as a law enforcement, he said Silk Road was a law enforcement officer's wet dream. He said totally anonymous, except that you have to turn in a shipping address. So the DEA sets up a front account and starts selling tiddly amounts of drugs. A few hits of acid here, a few ecstasy pills there, and so forth. And once they've built up a good reputation, they start posting huge sales like intent to distribute, go away forever amounts. The buyers then get busted, and the DEA looks like a hero, and this continues until the front account's busted. So it can work both ways. Anyway, let me just skip over a couple of other things here. So at the end of the day, though, I would assert that law enforcement in this business is onto a losing proposition. Even if you which they did, in fact, shut down Silk Road, nonetheless, somebody else can set another site up. So it turned out, basically, the only way law enforcement can succeed here is if they get lucky. And this is exactly what happened with Silk Road. So Dread Pirate Roberts turned out to be 29-year-old Ross Overy, operating out of a coffee shop in San Francisco, and he got caught because he got careless. So then, you go onto the bit at the Silk Road website, you get that. Nice announcement from the feds, thank you very much. Within days, people were talking about Silk Road 2, 3, 4, whatever. And then we get the following. It didn't take long. See, to close it down on somebody else, it's the same old problem with prohibition, whether it's alcohol, drugs, or anything else like that. Same problem. So, basically, you chop one head off, and another will always grow in its place. Prohibition never works because the market always finds a way. Now, it's sometimes suggested in these sorts of discussions that the government should attack the Tor itself. And I would assert that there are two problems with this. The first is moral. Not that that stops the government. The point is that the Tor is used by many people for whom we would have natural sympathy. I'm thinking of Iranian dissidents or Arab Spring bloggers, Chinese dissidents and stuff like that. The technology is out there. And the second is practical. The Tor is distributed. There's no single point of failure. And so it's not clear what the government can actually do. The irony here, of course, is that there was a nice little irony that the government itself developed the technology. But it regarded the technology as a munition, but it lost control of it. And then, so it then privatized the technology, and it got out. And it's still, the government, while simultaneously wanting to shut it down, is still supporting it through the US State Department's Internet Freedom Budget. So again, one hand of the government doesn't know what the other is doing. So basically, it's a splendid illustration of the law of unintended consequences, which is what you often find in policy discussions. So the very cryptographic technology the government developed to protect its secrecy has turned into a benevolent Frankenstein creature that escaped from their control and is now being used to protect the secrecy of private organisations against snooping by the government itself. And one can only hope that this modern-day Frankenstein hero does not suffer the fate of his predecessor Prometheus. Remember Prometheus, the guy who gave us fire from the gods. So these implications are very profound. And a good starting point is that the Bitcoin system has no borders. So to give another quote, as long as my encrypted Bitcoin wallet exists somewhere in the world, as long as I don't lose the bloody thing, such as on an email account, I can walk across national borders with nothing on me and retrieve my wealth from anywhere in the world with an internet connection. So, you know, you just have to get out of the country with nothing, and your wealth is transferred. This is real profound implications. So it's an internationally mobile store of value that offers a high degree of protection against predatory governments and unsafe banks. In essence, it fulfills the role that used to be provided by Swiss bank accounts before the Americans got rough with the Swiss and basically stopped bank secrecy. So the kind of uses are fairly obvious. You can squirrel your wealth abroad, you can circumvent exchange controls, you can circumvent capital controls, you can make anonymous transfers, and you can evade taxes, i.e. not pay your taxes. Basically, you can do whatever you want with your wealth with Bitcoin. And I would say the outstanding example is the right to make payments to whoever you wish. And again, the example here that comes to mind is WikiLeaks. Now, when WikiLeaks got going in November 2010, the United States government organized an illegal financial blockade of WikiLeaks. It seized their accounts and banned Visa, MasterCard and all these from making payments. What kept WikiLeaks going was Bitcoin. You could make donations in Bitcoin. And the government couldn't do anything about it. So basically, what I'm getting at here is the idea that financial privacy is a basic human right. And we know this from the study of history. Many of the Jews in the 30s who escaped from Germany and so forth were protected by Swiss banks, British banks and so forth. The secrecy of your financial affairs is a basic human right. Now I know that the statists do, they always invent excuses, and the standard one is that we need these controls because these terrorists, etc., etc. A lot of rubbish. There was a recent article in the Atlantic magazine, and it pointed out that Americans were as likely to be killed by their furniture as by terrorists. You know, because your TV might fall on you and kill you. It does happen. It doesn't happen that often. Anyway, the point is that this is just the thin end of the wedge. And, I mean, let's look at it from the government's point of view. There's nothing much they can do. The combination of anonymity and independence means they can't bring Bitcoin down by conventional means. Closing a website doesn't really make much difference. They can shut down an individual or shut down an organization, so what? They make pathetic attempts against Mt. Gox and various Bitcoin users, which is just laughable. What else? The only thing they can do is spy on everybody. But guess what? That's exactly what they're doing. And I would remind you that we wouldn't even know about much of this skullduggery if it wasn't for Ed Snowden and WikiLeaks and these guys. And it's not just prison. To give you an example, there was an article in Wired last year revealed that the US government was building a massive spy center in Utah. This is 5 times bigger than the capital. Its purpose was to intercept, decipher, analyze and store vast chunks of the world's communications. This, of course, leading to major diplomatic rows over the summer. Basically, it would collect all forms of communication. And by all forms, I mean all forms, including internet chatter, parking receipts, travel itineraries, you name it. Pocket litter, basically. It would collect everything. And one official involved admitted, he said, everyone is a target. And there's nobody innocent in this. It was Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's right-hand man, who said, I can make anybody guilty, you know, just by a little bit of work on them. So nobody is safe. Of course, these efforts violate the 4th Amendment of the United States, which prohibits mass searches and seizures related to the unspecified crimes of unnamed persons. But that doesn't matter. There's no longer any rule of law. So my bottom line is, when it comes to Big Brother, you cannot be paranoid enough. Okay? Okay. And also, you've got to recognise the context here. For a long time now, we've had sort of chipping away at the right to freedom. We have the right to freedom, but this exception, that exception, the other exception. This country is just as bad. So we have so many encroachments, because we need exceptions to counter money laundering, terrorism, offshore financial centres that offer lower tax regimes and so forth. We want to counter payments to whistleblowers and organisations on government blacklists and all this sort of nonsense. Always some excuse to grab more power. So in the land of the free, people used to be free to do anything. Now they're free to do anything except what the government says they can't do. It's a long and growing list. So there's no longer basically any right to privacy in this country or the United States. And I emphasise that Uncle Sam is not the only villain here. In this country, the UK government recently proposed a law that would allow it to monitor all internet traffic through the UK. And it's already a criminal offence to refuse to hand over passwords to government officials who demand them. However, UK residents can get around this by using a Tor browser. It's downloadable for free. You just have to follow certain ground rules about protecting your security, like don't open PDFs while the thing is on, this sort of thing. And as for the requirement to surrender passwords, these can be circumvented in ingenious ways. You can use automatic rekeying of secure channels, which makes the old keys inaccessible. And of course, this is the nice bit, you can also use cryptography to hide the fact that you're using cryptography, so they can't get you there. You just have to know what to do. And so, basically, the good news is that thanks to, I think, strong cryptography is the key here. The balance of power is shifting back away from Big Brother. And there's nothing much that they can do about it. Increasingly, people are just disappearing into the cipher sphere to do what they want. Now, let me just wrap up just a few comments. I'd like to emphasize that these two examples, I could give you more, we'll be here all night, boozing time soon. They show that the demand for private money is very much alive and well, and the market is well capable of meeting that demand. And this is at a time when trust in government money is at an all-time low. That's the first point. The second point is that the biggest problem faced by private money issuers is attack by the state. This has always been the problem throughout history. And historically, the response of government to people meddling in money has been savage. Absolutely savage. I mean, in the 18th century, people were burned at the stake in this country for meddling with money. It's, you're talking about savagery here. And I would assert that this medieval mindset is very much alive and well. And I think there's an old crime called lèse-majesté, which is to attack the sovereign, very serious offence. This is how private money is often treated, and I think Bernard von Nothouse's experience very much shows that. Of course, another point to emphasise, the Liberty Dollar, and indirectly Bitcoin, point to the continuing allure of gold. And advocates of Keynesians especially sneer at gold. But look, we cut the link with gold in 1971, and since then the dollar has lost 85% of its value, even by biased government statistics which understate the problem. Whereas the real value, the value of gold in real purchasing power has increased, 400%. So in these circumstances, why wouldn't you prefer gold to paper money, particularly fiat paper money? And of course, alternatively, you might prefer cryptocurrency. At least it gives you a lot more anonymity. And again, cryptocurrency reminds us of the astonishing ability of the private sector to innovate in ways that we can't possibly foretell in advance. So let me just highlight some of the breakthroughs that cryptocurrency embodies. First off, is the first currency to take off without having intrinsic value. It's never happened before. Even this pound in your pocket, which has this worthless legend that says, I promise to pay the bearer on demand. Do you know what that legend means? That legend hails from a time when the pound note was a receipt to gold. And the pound was gold. Now it's just meaningless. So I often used to say to my students, at least the Americans are more honest, because what does the American dollar say? It says, in God we trust. So never before have we had intrinsically worthless money produced without going through the link with gold or whatever. So, and of course, I'm slightly oversimplifying here, because even paper money, however worthless, does have other uses. You can use it for sanitary purposes, or wallpaper. I remember once a lovely picture, I wish I'd got it for you, whereby it was on the border of Zimbabwe, and it was a toilet, and it said, no Zim dollars. Anyway, so basically, the second thing is that Bitcoin provides a novel solution to the trust problem that Nakamoto talks about. Instead of relying on an individual or organization, it achieves trust through a peer-to-peer network. This is most profound. Okay. And then thirdly, to highlight the obvious, Bitcoin or the cryptocurrencies are entirely non-governmental. So once it got up and running, it became independent of anything and can continue without any individual organization. And this is fantastic, because it makes it very hard to shut down. And then finally, of course, a vast degree of anonymity. Not perfect, but it's unprecedented. So this, of course, raises profound issues of an emerging spontaneous social order, and in particular the prospect of a crypto-anarchic social order in which there is no longer any government role in the monetary system, and hopefully no government. So thank you all. Good night. We'll go to Durham.
How do you spell Tor?
T-O-R. Yeah, T-O-R. It's short for the onion routes or the hasn't really made.
So when you've got alternatives to Bitcoin out, more recent versions like Litecoin and things like that, what are the sort of problems with Bitcoin that the newer like cryptocurrencies attempt to solve? Do they?
They do. Well, first off, I mean, the market share of Bitcoin, the last time I checked, was something like 99.9 something percent, so it's overwhelmingly dominant. But there were some finer points about the verification process. I remember was one of them. And also, I can see a problem with Bitcoin, which I would like somebody to develop a cryptocurrency that addresses that problem. And that problem has to do with the inelasticity of its supply. So the only way Bitcoin can achieve significant market share is if there's a huge increase in its price. And what I would like to see, that's simply because the supply is not able to adjust. So it would be nice to have something which the supply schedule was more elastic. And that would mean that they could achieve take-up, a pronounced market share without the price going through the roof. Why that worries me slightly is because, I mean, I think we can see it now, Bitcoin has become the object of a speculative bubble. I'm not saying it won't go a long, long way, but the point is that you can't get markets that work where you just know with certainty that the market price can only go up and up and up and up. It's not an equilibrium. So I think that's going to be a problem. And there's another problem. And you might say this is a cop-out. I grant you it is. But Bitcoin was maybe the second cryptocurrency. The problem is it's set in stone. And so what you'll often find in innovation is that the guy that wins out the product or the company that wins out in the long term is often not the first mover, because the flaws in the design are set in stone. And so even though I may not be able to tell you all those flaws, nonetheless they're there. And so my belief is that eventually Bitcoin will be displaced by something else. What I would dearly like to see is if one could take the Bitcoin model and make that supply schedule elastic. And I naively thought for a few months that was simply a case of changing a few lines of code. Not that I've got the skills to do that type of programming. But then I realised, because it can't be that simple, because you have to have a feedback loop. And so what would be the price that would, let's say you related the supply to a price, what price would it be? Now if you say that it was the Mt. Gox price, for example, then the government can break it by closing that thing down. So you have to have a formula that allows feedback, but still keeps the distributed nature of the thing. It's a bit more difficult, probably a lot more difficult than I originally appreciated. That's a good question. Anybody else? Sure.
I think it was just a comment rather than a question on the Zimbabwe case. I remember, I think the German physical money printers actually wanted to stop printing the Zimbabwe dollar because they were actually quite worried about how they were even going to get any payment for their work. Because they were printing into the hundreds of billions. And so they were even worried about, like, are they actually going to get any money for the work that they're doing, printing all this money?
Yes. There's loads of stories. That's a great story. I didn't know that one, but one of my favourites was when in the German hyperinflation, where they were working all night printing money, as they had to do, and they couldn't work out where all the inflation came from. And then they were working so hard that in the morning when they checked, they realised that they'd not printed the right notes. And in fact, all the notes that they'd spent all night printing were not enough to pay for the overtime of the guys that were doing the printing. But here's a coincidence. Anybody tell me what the worst hyperinflation was?
Hungary.
Yes.
1946.
45-46. There were two Hungarians, if I remember, but the second one was... Now, I've seen the inflation rate, and it's something that makes astronomical figures look like microscopic. But when the Hungarian inflation wiped itself out, it basically burnt itself out, somebody calculated that the whole money supply of the Hungarian pengo was worth 1/10 of 1 United States cent. Anybody else? Please.
I have a question. How I understand, how should answer to a mainstream economist when they say, well, yeah, we've got Fed, the bank is bad, as long as you keep the inflation low enough, we have this thing called neutrality of money. So money is neutral, you don't have. How would you counter this argument?
Well, I would say money isn't neutral. Inflation has real effects. Mind you, there are some forms of monetary policy which you can conceive of could be theoretically sort of neutral. Even that is pushing it. But in practice it isn't. And partly that's because of the unpredictability of monetary policy. What monetary economists and central bankers tend to do is they tend to duck issues by giving you a theoretical construct. So they say, well, for example, don't worry about inflation because we've got an inflation target. But the inflation target's been broken the last 5 years. So where's the governance in place to discipline the central bank for failing to meet its inflation target? Oh, that's just an inconvenient detail. It's not. It's the essence of the problem. So often you get fobbed off with theory to cover the fact that there's some institutional failure. And that's really the kind of thing we need to keep getting back to. But no, money neutrality is a product of certain economic models. It's not a feature of the real world. And inflation is not a steady process. It's unsteady. And it has real effects partly because of that unsteadiness and the fact that it's unpredictable.
Just one more quick one for me, sorry. So, would a potential flaw in Bitcoin be that it's got kind of like this small team of programmers that are working to maintain it, and that the government conceivably could target them and, you know, destroy the troubleshooting mechanism?
That's a good point. I mean, the development team for Bitcoin, the way I think about it, you're right, it is a potential problem. But what would you say to that? The system is running itself and they periodically tune it. But the tuning might take the form, the way I think